So first, let's go in order. One is, as you said, grief reaction, bereavement. Grief is in general. Any loss can cause grief. Loss of money can cause grief. Loss of functioning of a limb can cause grief. Right? Whereas bereavement is specific to death. Somebody has died and the person enters a bereavement process. And then somebody need not be a human being, it can be a pet as well, right? The stages of grief. The pioneer in this field is Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. I always remember the stages as DABDA, D-A-B-D-A. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. So basically it is the same. Denial is the patient is so much in shock that he or she cannot deal with the situation. So remember we discussed about psychological defense mechanisms, unconscious defense mechanisms. Dissociation is also one of the defense mechanisms. So therefore in this case it is denial. When the event or whatever is happening to you becomes so painful that you cannot handle it, then the mind will initiate an unconscious defense mechanism called denial. Because it's too painful, it's too stressful. You can't face the reality. So, denial is a defense mechanism in that case. And then of course, when they slowly realize that there is no escape from the situation, anger sets in. Typically things like, why me? Why am I suffering? Why him? Why did he have to die this time? Could have been anybody else. Or if it is to do with a major diagnosis, then again, why me? Why do I have to suffer cancer, for example? So that is part of the anger reaction. Rarely it can become violent. Verbal and physical aggression can also occur. And then the bargaining process starts, especially to do with illnesses. Maybe it can reduce, maybe if I do this, things will get better, those sort of things. Then a phase of depression, when the inevitability of the situation sets in, the patient develops low mode, and the process continues like a mild depressive episode. Finally, it is resolved through acceptance. When things become inevitable, with the passage of time, person realizes that things have to move on, nothing can remain same. The only constant in our lives is change. Nothing is permanent. You know what I mean? Things have to change, therefore things have to move on. So even death is a type of change. Okay, so as the person realizes these facts, they will move on. So this is what happens in the normal bereavement reaction. So in other words, we are saying having grief reaction or bereavement reaction is a natural reaction to any kind of loss. And it should not be interfered with. One should not try to curtail it. One should not try to reduce it. You have to go through it. It's a natural process. It goes through its own phases. And the phases resolve themselves by moving from one phase to another and finally into acceptance. So usually we say up to 6 months should be allowed for the entire grieving process to be completed. For acceptance to set in, we need at least 6 months. So when does it become a problem? It's a bit like what we discussed with anxiety. Everybody has anxiety, right? When does it become a problem? When the duration increases, when the quality of anxiety reaction is different from the usual anxiety. And the third criteria which I always put in, when your life is affected. Quality of life, that is the key word. Quality of, key phrase there is quality of life is affected. This condition is preventing you from doing all the usual things that you do. So that is when it starts to become a problem. Therefore, if you apply that to bereavement reaction, then the complicated bereavement reaction would be either too long, that is more than 6 months, going beyond 1 year even, or qualitatively it is different from the usual kind of bereavement reaction, by which I mean there are some extra additions to the usual grief, sadness, crying spells. When do you start getting worried that this is not normal grief reaction? Intense feeling of guilt. Typically, this may happen when a child passes away, for example. The parents undergo intense feeling of guilt, which is probably related to their suspicion that they were not good enough to look after the child, for example. The guilt issue may be very intense if it is a very traumatic loss, or if it is survivor type of guilt. You understand? Why did I have to survive? Why did I also not die with the other person? Typically happens in an accident scenario where one person has died and the other has survived. Suicidal ideas. We discussed yesterday, bereavement, grief, huge risk factors for suicide attempt. Okay. Or it could be extreme cases, hallucinations also. Seeing the dead person, could be visual hallucinations. So hallucinations, visual hallucinations, one of those rare instances where it's not due to an organic condition. Remember, we discussed visual is usually organic, whereas auditory is usually functional type of illnesses, the hallucinations. So that could occur in this. So it could be delusions in severe cases. In depression, nihilistic type of delusions, those could occur. Extreme negative thoughts. Or it could just enter into a depressive phase. Bereavement grief reactions may be just a precursor to depression, and then it proceeds along the expected lines of depression, and then you will have to treat the patient with antidepressants. As you said, normal grief reaction, there is no indication for antidepressants. Do not intervene at all. That's what I would say. Don't give anything, because the family may be very concerned. You just have to psychoeducate them and reassure them and say that this will pass. Let it go through the process. Don't interfere in the normal process. Okay. So only when it goes into abnormality, then you have to intervene. And again, I always talk about the quality of life that is being affected in the long run. Then you have to do it. So in some complicated grief reactions, you get all sorts of things, such as the person behaving like a deceased person, having nightmares about the death, or as I said, visual hallucinations. The person's behavior also changes. He or she may start behaving abnormally. There may be behavioral disorder, irritability, verbal or physical aggression, or there could be complete isolation, mutism. Loss of sleep may be very intense. Okay, extreme cases, psychotic symptoms may be present, and they try to preserve the situation as it was at the time of death. That means if the deceased person was living in a room, they'll leave the room in the same state of affairs as when the person passed away without changing anything, because they don't want to change the final memory of the patient. Preserving the personal belongings of the deceased person, such as clothes, personal items, even body parts like hair or whatever, they may preserve them as memories. But remember that it is all about moving on. There is no alternative to moving on. If you get stuck, then that means there is a problem. So that is what this grief reaction is all about. Ultimately, after 6 months, you have to move on. Nothing is permanent, everything is subject to change. Change is the only permanent. And no two moments in life are alike. They are not the same. There is a saying, isn't there, where they say you don't step into the same river twice. That means the water in the river is flowing constantly. It is not the same river as it was a moment ago. So that is applicable to life as a whole. So that is what this is all about. If it doesn't move on, then there is a problem. And as I told you, if it becomes complicated or the patient goes into depression, then treatment is necessary. It could be bereavement counseling to begin with. There are counselors who specialize in bereavement counseling, who talk about death, dying, spiritual aspects, all those things. So maybe that is required. If depression is too severe, then you go along your usual biopsychosocial route and consider medications also. So what are we talking about in this lecture today? One is affect and mood, which we have already discussed in mental state examination, and the conditions which are subclinical types of depression or mania, that is dysthymia, hyperthymia, and cyclothymia. Depression, hypomania and mania, bipolar affective disorder, mixed affective disorder, which has features of both depression and mania, schizoaffective disorder, which has features of both psychotic conditions such as schizophrenia and mood disorders, and depressive pseudodementia. Affect and mood, you know that, right? Affect is the expressions that you get to see on a person's face depending on the situation, the reaction to the external situation, that is affect. Whereas mood is the more inner, long-lasting, pervasive, mental, emotional state of the patient, which does not change too much according to external situations. So that is mood. So when we are talking about somebody with depression, it is mood that we are predominantly concerned with, because even a depressive patient can smile. So the affect can change in a depressed person, even though the changes are less than in a normal person. But mood will be depressed. So that is what we mean by affect and mood. Then, as I've already described, dysthymia is chronic low mood and feelings of emptiness over a long period of time. But the criteria are not severe enough to be called depression. That is what it is. Hyperthymia is the opposite, which is elevated mood, but subclinical and not severe enough to be called mania. Cyclothymia is altering between dysthymia and hyperthymia. But again, it is not enough severe. It's not severe enough to call it bipolar disorder. Clear about that?
Yes,
Let me also finish talking about depressive pseudodementia while we are here. It is, as the name suggests, it is pseudodementia. That means it's false dementia. Because in people above 65 years of age, the elderly population, sometimes depression may present as memory loss, short-term memory loss. And you may erroneously conclude that the person has dementia, because dementia is very prevalent in that age group. But the memory loss is because of low mood, and you have to establish that by clinically asking certain relevant questions. There are differences between pseudodementia and dementia, which I think we'll cover in the seminar. So, but for now, just remember that depression in the elderly may present as memory loss, and that's not dementia. So you have to treat the person for depression, and usually when the depression improves, the memory loss also improves. Okay, so now let's get into the main topics under mood disorder. Okay, depression. There are criteria for each of these conditions, of course. I mean, there are ICD-10 and DSM-5 criteria for both depression and mania. But generally speaking, the three core features of depression are these three: low mood, anhedonia, and energy. So low mood means depressed mood, which is unrelated to circumstances. Unlike affect, the mood does not change, and it is worse in the mornings. In the case of depression, the patient wakes up feeling pretty miserable, downcast and gloomy and sad, which is also part of the other biological problem, that is early morning awakening or late insomnia. So the patient may end up getting up in a very bad state of mind. So that is low mood. Of course, there will be diurnal variations, but generally it is worse in the mornings. Then anhedonia is loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities. such as if the patient has had a hobby like collecting stamps, for example, latterly, then if he or she becomes depressed, will lose all interest in that activity and he will just give it up basically. He will not enjoy it anymore. That's what it is. So that is anhedonia. And anergia, as the name suggests, is lack of energy. The patient feels quite lethargic and tired and unable to motivate himself to do anything. So that is loss of energy. So the three core features of depression, which would be present in almost every patient with depression, are low mood, anhedonia, and energy. It is beneficial from your point of view to remember to divide the symptoms into biological symptoms and psychological symptoms, which we did in anxiety disorders also. So the same applies to mood disorders. So biological or somatic symptoms. So these will be things like early morning awakening or late insomnia, as I just mentioned, worse mood in the mornings, loss of appetite, and because there is loss of appetite, it leads to loss of weight. Psychomotor retardation or agitation, both can happen. The patient can become absolutely still, not willing to move about, or so agitated that he is moving up and down constantly. Any of these can happen. Menstrual abnormalities in women, usually amenorrhea is what is likely to happen, or delayed periods, and loss of libido in both the genders. No sexual interest whatsoever. So these are the bodily symptoms of depression. We will move on to psychological or cognitive symptoms, the thinking symptoms. What is wrong with the thought process? So in this, you have reduced concentration or memory. Memory problem, as I mentioned, especially common among the elderly people. But among the younger population, it's likely to be reduced concentration because the focus, attention, sustained attention, which leads to concentration, is difficult when the mood is depressed. Poor self-esteem, because they also have to be what we call negative automatic thoughts, which we discussed under cognitive behavior therapy. So all those things lead to assumptions about one's self-esteem. One is not good enough. One looks bad. One will act bad in public. These sort of things can happen, which will lead to poor self-esteem. And then there is guilt. Guilt is one of the core features, core psychological features of depression. That is, I deserved this. I have done very bad things in life, and therefore, whatever is happening to me is right. I have let down people in the past. That is why all this is happening to me. So this is the kind of thought process which leads directly to guilt. And feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. Hopeless as in there's nothing for me in the future, or helpless as in I don't know why I'm feeling like this, but I just can't help it. Yeah. And all of these are precursors to developing suicidal ideas, or at the very least deliberate self-harm ideas without any suicidal intention. So these are the psychological symptoms of depression. All of them are very important. You have to cover these core features, biological features, and psychological features when you are taking history for anybody with depression. Of course, you have to go through the criteria, diagnostic criteria, but make sure that you cover these points as well. If it goes towards severe depression, then the patient may end up having psychotic symptoms. So there is a separate category called severe depression with or without psychotic symptoms. So what are the likely psychotic symptoms if somebody goes into severe depression? So these are mood congruent delusions. Remember, we talked about incongruent and congruent delusions. That is, the delusion is in keeping with the predominant mood of the patient. That means if the mood is depressed, the delusional content will also be very grim and negative, such as, I am very bad, I am dying, or I am dead. So in extreme cases where the patient feels that he or she is already dead, that is called nihilistic delusions or highly negative ideas presenting as delusions. That's what it is, nihilistic delusions. Extreme negative ideas which are firm and fixed in spite of evidence to contrary, that is nihilistic delusion. And it is mood congruent. It is in keeping with the predominant depressed mood of the patient. Along with the delusions, there may also be accusatory or defamatory auditory hallucinations. Auditory hallucinations which directly scold the patient, call him or her bad names, swear at the patient, or accuse the patient of some kind of wrongdoing, which is all part of the general feelings of guilt and hopelessness and low self-esteem that the patient is already experiencing. Their loss of functioning is so severe that they feel that they do not exist anymore. Rarely, it can also present with olfactory hallucinations, such as smelling rotting flesh, which is again related to the nihilistic delusions. Sometimes the delusion in the patient may be that he or she is already dead and his or her flesh is rotting and decaying and smelling. So that could lead to olfactory hallucinations such as smelling rotting flesh. And remember, we in the psychopathology lecture, we talked about mutism and stupor and all those things. In severe cases of depression, all of those things can happen. They can go mute. No matter how much you try, they will not talk. And they may enter a depressive stupor-like state where they are immobile, not responding to external stimuli. So we'll move on to mania, which is the opposite of depression. So the core features of mania, 3 of them would be euphoria, feeling of extreme happiness, irritability, that is, they get easily provoked and irritated, and they can end up shouting or assaulting somebody, and labile mood or labile affect. Okay, the mood or the affect changes from minute to minute. It goes from sadness to laughing to looking anxious to irritable, can change from one to another. Euphoria, when I say euphoria, it is like extreme happiness, more than what is to be expected, more than what the situation demands, happy for no reason. So again, we'll talk about the same things that we did in depression, that is biological or somatic symptoms. In mania, everything is opposite to depression. That is, there is reduced need for sleep. In depression, there is insomnia, whereas in mania, they voluntarily don't want to sleep because they are so full of energy. They feel that lying down and sleeping is a waste of time. They want to be doing things continuously, endlessly, tirelessly. That is what happens in mania. So they have increased energy. So there is almost always psychomotor agitation. And in extreme cases, the need to act is so intense that they don't know which one to do first. And it is not organized activity, remember, it is all very chaotic. They want to do everything at the same time. And it can become so extreme that they can go into panic stupor, a paradoxical situation. Their mind is bombarded with so many thoughts, racing thoughts, that they don't know which one to pay attention to first. It's chaotic thought process. Accordingly, the behavior will also be chaotic. They want to do everything at the same time. And in extreme cases, they can just go into a stupor-like situation. But in less extreme situations, they are energetic, they are moving about, they are doing things which are not required, and they don't sleep. That is how the family describes. He or she is always doing things, even though we ask him to stop doing it, even though there is no need for him to do such a thing. Tinkering, breaking, rejoining, unwanted things. Understand? So again, let's talk about psychological or cognitive symptoms. So there is elevated self-esteem or grandiosity, exactly opposite of depression. There was low self-esteem. Whereas here there is elevated self-esteem. They think very highly of themselves. So that leads to grandiosity, and in extreme cases, grandiose delusions, another type of delusion, wherein the grandiosity may be related to identity or ability. Identity as in, I am God, I am Superman, or ability as in, I can fly, I can do anything, or it could be about possession also. I'm the richest person on planet Earth. I have Swiss bank accounts. I own villas in every major country. Even though none of it is true, by the way. And even though you will go and present evidence to them saying that you are bankrupt, you don't have any money, they will continue to believe that they are. So that is grandiose delusions, grand ideas about themselves. Poor concentration, which is common to both depression and mania, is it not? Although for entirely different reasons. In mania, the poor concentration is because the mind is so full of thoughts. So there is accelerated thinking. Remember, we talked about pressure of speech and flight of ideas in thought disorders in psychopathology lecture. So there is pressure of speech or thoughts, as in there are lots of thoughts invading the patient's mind again and again repeatedly. And there are flight of ideas. There is one idea leading to another connected idea, and that leads to another connected idea. And it goes on and on, like a butterfly jumping from flower to flower. The thoughts keep moving from one to another, one topic to another. That's what happens in manic thinking. And there is, of course, impaired judgment and insight. Insight is lost in mania, please remember. Pretty early on, insight is lost. They don't believe that they are ill. They don't believe that they need any kind of treatment. Judgment is impaired. That means they'll do things that are highly regrettable. Once their mood becomes normal, and if somebody says you did that, they will regret it. They will do such things when they are manic. It may be things, I told you about specific risks, right? So it could be things like driving at top speed, or it could be overspending. There's no judgment at all. Even though their money, the bank balance is very less, they'll go about from mall to mall buying unwanted things and running into huge debts and financial problems. So again, mania may be associated with psychotic symptoms. In fact, you could say that mania, when it becomes full-fledged and established, is a psychotic disorder. It's a mood disorder that becomes a psychotic disorder. Okay, remember our dimensional classification of psychiatric problems. This is what it is. So what are the psychotic symptoms of mania? Formal thought disorder or disorder of thought form. Remember, thought disorders can be disorders of thought stream, form, and content. So this is disorder of thought form. Circumstantiality, which is involving unnecessary details in whatever the patient is talking about. Going about in a circuitous manner and including trivial details which are not at all required to answer the question that you have asked. That is circumstantiality. Tangentiality is like a tangent in a circle. Patient is talking about one thing and suddenly goes off into a tangent, into a totally different topic. Flight of ideas, one thought process leads to a related, connected thought. That is flight of ideas. So all of these could be seen. Delusions, again, mood congruent. That means they are in keeping with the predominant elevated mood of the patient, euphoric mood. Therefore, the mood congruent delusions will also be pretty grandiose about ability, possession, and identity. Rarely it can be persecutory. That is, they feel that somebody is trying to harm them. The persecutory delusion may be related to the grandiose delusion. That is, they may believe that they are the president of the country, which is a grandiose delusion. And following which, the person may think that somebody is trying to assassinate him because or her because he or she is the president of the country. So that is a persecutory delusion. They could have abnormal perceptions such as hyperacusis, which is enhanced hearing ability. They can hear even whispers. Okay. Hyperesthesia, their skin becomes very, very sensitive. highly sensitive skin. Even slight pressure, they will feel as pain. Or they may sometimes hear voices also, as in auditory hallucinations. Psychopathological distinction between mania and schizophrenia. What is the difference? Because I told you even mania is a psychotic condition, and so is schizophrenia. So thought form. In mania, as we discussed, there is circumstantiality, tangentiality, and flight of ideas. Whereas in schizophrenia, there is loosening of association. That means there is no connection between one thought process to another. Neologisms, which we discussed earlier, is nothing but coining new terms which do not exist in the lexicon. But the term has some kind of personal significance for the patient. Only the patient knows the meaning of that term. And thought block, as in the patient is thinking something and suddenly the thought is blocked and he cannot think beyond that. So next, delusions, mood congruent, that is grandiose, leading on to persecutory delusions in mania. Whereas in schizophrenia, delusions unrelated to mood, bizarre delusions which are not, which sound very fantastic, delusions of passivity, that is thought being interfered with, or the body being under control of some external agency. So these are typically schizophrenic delusions. Pressured speech is seen in mania, which is difficult to interrupt. You cannot get a word in edgeways when a manic person is talking to you, because of all that circumstantiality, tangentiality, and flight of ideas, and pressure of speech. Whereas in schizophrenia, speech is hesitant or halting. It can even be guarded. That is, the patient thinks twice before answering your question. Biological symptoms significantly reduce need for sleep, increase physical and mental energy in mania. Schizophrenia, sleep is less disturbed, and they are less hyperactive. Psychomotor functioning, there may be agitation in mania. Whereas schizophrenia, it could be anything. It could be agitation, it could be catatonic symptoms, all those Mid-Jahan and Mid-Macon that we discussed, or catalepsy, or negative symptoms, which is patient isolating himself or herself, not talking a lot, losing interest in everything. Mood elevated, irritable, or labile. So you have to, this is the flow chart for making the diagnosis. Functional impairment or socio-occupational functioning, that is social relationships, friends, relatives, as well as holding a job properly. So is that going on? So if there is minimal interference with work or social activities, then consider that the patient may not have any major mental illness, or it could be cyclothymia, that is alteration between low mood and high mood, but not severe enough to call it mania, or other differential diagnoses. If there is interference with work or social activities, but it is minimal, it is not totally disrupted, the patient is still able to maintain relationships and still able to work without getting irritated at work or without losing much concentration, so then that will be hypomania. So hypomania is a milder version of mania, where there is no severe psychotic symptoms such as delusions and all those things. And most importantly, socio-occupational disruption is not present in hypomania, but the mood elevation is there. The core features that we discussed earlier, they are still there. That is labile affect, irritability, and euphoric mood, but not very euphoric, happy mood, excessively happy mood. So that could be seen in hypomania. If that progresses where there is complete disruption of work or social activities, and the patient ends up in a mental state where he or she has to be admitted, then that is mania. And of course, if psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations, they are also present, then it will be mania with psychotic features. And if they are absent, if it is only mania with socio-occupational disruption, then that is without psychotic features. We'll talk about whether, it's unipolar depression. Unipolar means it's only depression. And when we say bipolar, it is mania and depression, which we'll discuss shortly. So this is a flow chart to decide whether it is that or this. Okay. So depressed, elevated, or irritable mood. then you have to ask yourself the question, is it secondary to a medical condition or some kind of psychoactive substance, that is street drugs? So if the answer is yes, then it is likely to be organic mood disorder or substance-induced mood disorder. Like I always keep telling you in psychiatry, rule out organic conditions first. And second condition you have to rule out is drug-induced problems, always, before you consider functional illnesses. Clear? So that should happen right at the beginning. Then, if it is not an organic condition or substance-induced problem, then you ask yourself whether occurs simultaneously with schizophrenia-like symptoms. Are there any psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations? If yes, then it is likely to be a condition called schizoaffective disorder, which is nothing but the occurrence of psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations, which are common in schizophrenia, as well as mood related symptoms such as depressed mood or manic mood or whatever in the same episode, not one after the other. The patient is experiencing everything in the same episode. So that becomes a schizoaffective disorder. That means it has got features of both psychotic disorder as well as mood disorder. Schizo part indicates the psychotic disorder. Affective part indicates the mood disorder. So then you ask yourself, what is the nature of the current mood episode? Okay, how is the current mood? After your full history and mental state examination, you have to ask yourself, what is the current mood of the patient? So if you feel that it is depressed episode, depressive mood, then you ask, has there been a previous hypomanic, manic or mixed episode? I remember in past psychiatric history we discussed similar mental illnesses or any other mental illness experienced by the patient, you have to ask. So if there has been a hypomanic or manic or mixed, that is both depression and manic features in the same episode, have they occurred? If it has not occurred, has there been a previous depressive episode? If it is yes, previous history of depression also, then it is recurrent depressive disorder. That means it is still unipolar, that means only depression, but it is recurrent. Previous history of depression is also there, and this time also the patient is depressed. Never has the patient has had any manic episode. So that becomes unipolar but recurrent depressive disorder. Then you have to ask yourself if the present mood after your assessment is hypomanic or manic, or is it a mixture of both manic and depressive features occurring simultaneously in the same patient. So if that is the case, then you have to ask yourself, has there been a previous depressive, hypomanic, manic or mixed episode? If the answer is yes, then bipolar affective disorder will be your diagnosis. So, in other words, what we are saying is, even one manic or hypomanic or mixed episode is enough for you to make a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Doesn't have to be depression followed by mania, then depression again, alternating. Just one hypomanic episode also is enough to make a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So the bipolarity refers to elevated mood, whereas when I say unipolar, it means it is only depression. Chronic low-grade depression or cycles of mood, mild elation and mild depression, which is nothing but dysthymia, cyclothymia and hyperthymia, right? They are like subclinical, they are chronic problems which have become part of the patient's personality, and they are not severe enough to be called depression or mania. So that will be dysthymia, cyclothymia, hyperthymia. So if the patient has had only depressive episodes, that is unipolar depression. But if the depression is coming back again and again, that is recurrent depressive disorder, but it is still unipolar only. Or if the patient has had only one depressive episode and is presenting to you, that is straightforward unipolar depression. The moment the patient has a hypomanic or manic or mixed affective disorder, that becomes bipolar disorder, regardless of whether that patient has had a depression or not. So, let's talk about bipolar disorder. So the criteria, basically, there are two types, remember, bipolar 1 and 2. Bipolar type 1 is characterized by at least one manic episode with or without hypomanic or depressive episode. This is what I was telling you earlier. Even one manic episode is enough for you to make a diagnosis of bipolar. But once you make a diagnosis of bipolar, it could be type 1 or type 2. Okay. In type 1, just one manic episode is enough. Whereas in type 2, you need one of each. That is at least one depressive and at least one hypomanic episode is required to make a diagnosis of bipolar type 2. At the end of the day, it is bipolar disorder. Don't get too bogged down between what is type 1 and what is type 2. Okay, once you establish a diagnosis of bipolarity, the management continues along expected lines. That is, you will have to give antipsychotics during manic episode, depression for antidepressants for depressive episode, and mood stabilizers, because the mood is going into the manic category and may even be going into depressive state. So that is why mood stabilizers are so important. Whereas you may not use mood stabilizers in somebody with unipolar depression, because it's only depression. There you use antidepressants. In either case, if manic or hypomanic episode has happened, that means patient is already bipolar. Please remember that. That is the key point I want you to remember. If it is only depression, even if it is recurrent depression, it is still unipolar depression. Whereas if a patient has had mania or hypomania, regardless of whether such a patient has had a depression or not, it is bipolar disorder. So the word bipolar pertains to whether the patient has had a manic episode or hypomanic episode. Just mania on its own, no other problems ever in the past or present, that is still bipolar disorder. Understood? Mixed affective state, as I told you, in the same episode, patient is experiencing sometimes elevated mood, sometimes low mood. Sometimes grandiose delusions, sometimes nihilistic delusions. So if the both are occurring in the same episode, that is mixed affective state. That is, it is a mixture of both depression and mania. But because there is presence of manic features also, it is still part of bipolar disorder only. This is where your comprehensive assessment comes into the picture. So you have to understand the patient wholly, for which you will have to talk to the patient, assess the patient, speak to the family members, and remember that part of the history where we discussed pre-morbid personality. You have to find out what kind of a person he or she was before falling ill for the first time. You understand? So then compare the in-between episodes mental state to how he was in pre-morbid personality. So if it is similar, then you will know that he was returning to baseline, which is normal. Or in between the episodes, if you feel that he was excessively happy, more than his pre-morbid personality, then it's likely to be hypomania or hyperthymia. It is difficult, I know, but that's why you have to be as comprehensive as possible in your assessment and understanding of the patient's mental state. For hypomania, you will be able to make out, at least the patient's family will be able to make out, those who know the patient very well. There is elevated mood, there is irritability, there is high energy. Okay. So patients, relatives who know the patient very well will be able to make out. Management, biopsychosocial, investigations and treatment. So if we consider unipolar, that is only depression, then investigations, maybe you would want to do a thyroid function test, ECG, blood tests like liver function tests, renal function tests. Psychological, maybe you will do a rating scale for depression, such as Beck's Depression Inventory, just to do a baseline reading before you start your treatment. Treatment. Antidepressants for depression. First line is SSRIs, as I keep telling you, unless there are very good reasons to give tricyclic antidepressants, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Then psychological. Could be cognitive behavior therapy to address the negative automatic thoughts such as low self-esteem, guilt, all those things. Or it could be milder cases, psychodynamic psychotherapy. It could just be supportive psychotherapy if you don't require, if you feel the patient does not require any specialized kind of therapies. If family issues are there, then maybe you might want to consider family therapy. If it is marital issues causing depression, marital therapy. So it depends on the patient's situations and the etiology for depression. Social would be addressing housing issues, financial issues, anything that might be socially contributing to the low mood. Whereas in mania, investigations, ECG again, because you'll be giving antipsychotics which can prolong the QTC interval. Liver function tests. Psychological, there are rating scales for mania also. Young mania rating scale, that is one of them. Social, again, home financial situations. Financial situation, the patient is likely to be in debt because of his overspending. Or there could be job loss because in mania, you remember, there is socio-occupational disruption. Treatment, in a manic episode, you have to give antipsychotic medication such as haloperidol, risperidone. If it is very severe and acute mania where behavior is severely disrupted, then you might have to give injectables, IM or IV, such as zeuclopentixol, haloperidol. You may want to combine that with benzodiazepines such as lorazepam, which is injectable. Diazepam is injectable. Because sleep is also disturbed, remember, so the patient needs a good sleeping period in a manic episode. So you have to give a combination of these sometimes. And when the patient is willing to accept medication, then oral antipsychotic treatment can be started. And you can start the mood stabilizer straight away in a manic episode. And usually, unless there are contraindications, we start lithium, which is the first line mood stabilizing agent. And by contraindications, I mean pre-existing renal disease or severe thyroid disorders, pregnancy. So these will be contraindications for lithium. If not, go for second line mood stabilizing drugs such as carbamazepine or oxcarbazepine and sodium valproate or semi-sodium valproate, divalproic acid. Remember that they can be used in the treatment of mania as well as prophylaxis of bipolar disorder, that is to keep the mood stable. That's why they are called mood stabilizers. Of course, if a bipolar patient also develops depression, then you have to give antidepressants. But remember what we discussed about antidepressants in the psychopharmacology lecture. There can be mood switch. Always be aware of such a possibility. Bipolar patient presents with depression, you put him or her on antidepressants. And suddenly, because the mood elevation is happening because of antidepressant activity, so a patient's episode may turn into a manic episode. Okay, so it is probably better to combine antidepressants with mood stabilizers if you are treating a bipolar disorder patient with depression. Sometimes, if it is very severe or if it is a rapidly cycling bipolar disorder, which by definition is more than 4 episodes in a year, in that case you might have to end up giving everything, that is antipsychotic, antidepressant and mood stabilizers. Psychological supportive psychotherapy, because during manic phase they are not going to engage in any kind of psychotherapy. Could be psychoeducation of the family to make them understand how to handle the problem. Then in social, address the financial issues, job issues, relationship issues, all those kind of things. In manic episode, the mainstay of treatment is biological. There is no alternative to medications. It is a psychiatric emergency situation. Biological or medical or pharmacological treatment is required during acute manic episode. Very difficult to manage person in full-fledged mania because they are irritable, their mood is elevated, and most problematic feature of mania is loss of insight. They don't believe they are ill. They don't believe they need any treatment. Family will be desperate. They don't know what to do. Somehow they would have dragged the patient to you against his or her will. And even after coming, the patient will be kicking and screaming, breaking things. It's a very, very, very difficult situation to manage. It's a true blue psychiatric emergency if ever there was one, and it will test your skills as a clinician. Suicide and parasuicide, right? And risk assessment, basically, that's what it is. And this is like a follow-up to what we did just now, in mood disorders, depression. As I keep telling you, if you are seeing a patient with depression and you don't ask about suicidal ideas, then you will fail that case. The differences between suicide and parasuicide, it is called, but it is also deliberate self-harm. That's the other terminology. Remember that these are not ICD-10 or DSM-5 diagnostic criteria or categories. They are just terminologies that we use to communicate with ourselves so that it becomes easier for us to understand. They are not official diagnoses. So suicide attempt is patient has intention of dying but did not die. Deliberate self-harm or parasuicide, as it is also called in the older terminologies, is patient harmed himself or herself without any intention of dying. Completed suicide is where the patient is already dead, that means he has made a successful suicide attempt or has committed suicide. Whereas suicide attempt means patient intended to die but has survived. And of course there is a difference in the risk factors for suicide and deliberate self-harm. Deliberate self-harm is more common among women, such as superficially cutting the wrists or taking overdoses with not enough medication to kill oneself. Completed suicide is more common among men because they just go for lethal means of committing suicide, such as jumping off a bridge, or hanging, for example, or shooting themselves. So that is more likely in men, completed suicide. So assessment and management, that's what we are talking about. We are still with assessment because this is very important. So when a patient comes to the hospital having made an attempt at whether it is deliberate self-harm or suicide attempt, regardless of that, you have to make a thorough assessment. But thorough assessment of what? The risk. That is the key element here. Risk to self. Remember, risk is divided into self, others, neglect, specific risks and all those things. It is risk to self that you are assessing. Typical example, patient presents to casualty having taken an overdose of 30 paracetamol tablets. You as a duty psychiatrist, you have been called by the emergency physician to make an assessment of the patient. The patient's medical condition has been stabilized. And now the physician is asking you whether to keep the patient or send him or her home. So that is where your thorough assessment comes into the picture. You have to make a thorough risk assessment, but it has to be quick as well, because you need to decide whether it is safe to send the patient home or not. Whether this person will go back home and repeat the same thing or do some other kind of method of committing suicide and become successful the second time. That is the key thing you have to decide in emergency situations. Of course, you will do your history taking, mental state examination and all that. But risk to self you have to assess, and you have to take in several factors in assessing that. So what are these factors? One is, as I told you, age. Does he belong to the age group where the suicide risk is high? Does he belong to any profession where the suicide risk is high, which we discussed? Marital status, recently divorced, recently separated, risk factor for suicide. Previous attempts of whether it is deliberate self-harm or suicide attempt, risk factor for present situation. Having a drug and alcohol problem is a risk factor because remember, alcohol is a disinhibitant and patient will do things which he or she will regret later on. Therefore, suicide attempts are also very common under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Many people consume overdose while attempting suicide along with alcohol. because it just makes it easier for them to take that extreme step, being drunk. Living alone, risk factor. No family, risk factor. Recent job loss, risk factor. Having a lot of financial problems, being in debt, huge risk factor. Being in debts, being chased by creditors, being harassed by banks for repayment of loans. It is that which drives people to suicide. Sometimes they may end up making suicide pacts where many members of the family commit suicide simultaneously. Or it could be secondary to some psychiatric problem such as depression. Classic example is depression, because in depression, as we discussed, there are already negative automatic thoughts such as feelings of guilt, hopelessness, worthlessness. So the natural precursor they are of suicidal ideas and going on to completed suicide. Could be schizophrenia. 10% of people with schizophrenia commit suicide. It's a huge risk factor for committing suicide. Recently discharged from psychiatric inpatient care, risk factor for suicide. Sometimes a patient can just say the right things for you to discharge the patient, and only later on you will realize that he or she got discharged to go and commit suicide. Any chronic pain can be a risk factor. End stage cancer is a risk factor. Having HIV infection is a risk factor. Recent history of bereavement and grief, loss of a loved one, risk factor for suicide. Big risk factor, especially if it was a sudden and traumatic loss, or if it was loss of a child. So, and again, religion has got nothing to do with this, because there is some kind of misconception saying that in certain religions it is forbidden and all those things. But I have seen patients across all religious sections committing or attempting suicide. So this is how you have to think and make a comprehensive risk assessment. Of course, there are rating scales which will help you rate the suicide risk also. Okay, so it's a combination of history, mental state examination, risk assessment and rating scales. You have to rely on all these things before you decide whether to admit the patient or not, or send home the patient. So typically, if a patient is in casualty, if you feel the risk is high, you will instruct the casualty nurse to shift the patient to psychiatric ward, where you will put the patient under observation. And if a patient is depressed, you start your antidepressant therapy. Involve the family, arrange for counseling sessions. If not, even if you feel the risk is minimal, you will discharge the patient, make sure that the family is aware of the situation. Somebody is present with the patient. Tablets are kept hidden so that the patient does not take another overdose. And call for follow-up within 10 days so that you know that everything is okay. Because the suicide attempt has already happened. That means a crisis is going on. That means help is necessary. So that means you should be in touch with the patient. Keep the patient safe while he or she is in the community until you see him or her again in the OPD. If you are doubtful about your own assessment, or if you are doubtful about whether the patient is safe or not, or if you are doubtful about whether the family members can cope with the situation or not, if you are doubtful about any of these, err on the side of safety. That is what I always say. Assume that the risk is very high and admit the patient under your care. Keep the patient in the loop. Be in touch with the patient, either directly or indirectly. Directly means you see the patient yourself through follow-up or after admitting, or get the community people to visit the patient at least. See, it's sharing of responsibilities. That is what I'm trying to tell you. You should not be the sole person who is entirely responsible for the patient's welfare. Multidisciplinary teamwork. There is community psychiatric nurse, there could be inpatient psychiatric nurse, there could be mental health social worker, there could be occupational therapist, there could be a physiotherapist, there is a psychologist who does the talking therapies, and then there is you, the doctor. So you are just part of the team. So sole responsibility should not lie with you. It is collective responsibility. And also a part of the responsibility is with the family also. So the family role will be important actually in the suicide risk management. They will be like co-therapists. So you have to enlist the family help. But if the patient lives alone, then the risk increases. So all the factors that we discussed, single, recent job loss, recent relationship loss, financial burden, living alone, if each of these is present, the risk will keep on increasing. But ultimately, you should be convinced about the risk level, about whether it is safe to send the patient home or not. And as I keep telling always, if you are doubtful, err on the side of safety and keep the patient with you. Don't send home. Management of suicide, the actual management is addressing the core issue. What is the underlying reason for a patient to feel so suicidal or bad about herself or himself? So you have to address that core issue. So it could be any one of these. It could be social reasons, it could be mental health problems, it could be medical problems. Address that issue. Treat the underlying cause basically. But that comes next after your suicide risk assessment and admission to psychiatric unit or whatever. The next step to do is addressing the underlying cause.